So in this tutorial, we're going to see open fractures. Now, for open fractures, you need to know that a fracture that a bone hematoma communicates with the environment is called an open fracture. Or simple definition of open fracture is that you can see the bone at the site of the injury or the wound. Is it clear? Or it is also a fracture involving a discontinuity of the living bone and the overlying skin. All that, those are the definition of open fractures. Now, the next thing after having the definition of open fractures, you should also speak about the classification of open fractures. Basically, you have classification of open fracture. Now, the classification of open fracture is called the Gustilo-Anderson classification. Anderson classification. Basically, it is the Gustilo-Anderson classification. Now, for the Gustilo-Anderson classification, classify into 1, 2, and 3. Is it clear? Based on 3 major elements. Classify on 1, 2, and 3 based on 3 major elements. The first element that it uses is the energy. Is it clear? The energy of the injury. Is it clear? If you have a mild or a low energy of injury, if you have low energy of injury, it is said to be a class 1 Gustilo-Anderson classification. If you have a moderate energy of injury, it is class 2, and if you have a high energy involved, it is class 3. Is it clear? The second one element that is used is the degree of contamination. Is it clear? The degree of contamination. Let's say in this case, let's take an example where you have a patient that was a motor rider having an open fracture. Let's say that motor rider was moving at fast speed. Is it clear? It means that there's going to be high energy involved. Is it clear? Now, the next thing again, let's speak about that motor rider at the level of degree of contamination. For the degree of contamination, you need to know that 1 is when you have a mild degree of contamination or a low degree of contamination. Moderate is when 2 is when you have a moderate degree of contamination, and 3 is when you have a marked degree of contamination. Let's say that you have that bike rider that was now moving but at a moderate speed. That's supposed to be having an open fracture, but moving at a moderate speed, meaning that his classification should be Gustilo-Anderson 2. But when he has that open fracture, he falls in a gutter containing feces. Is it clear? Now, since he falls in a gutter containing feces, it is now going to convert from this class 2 Gustilo-Anderson to a class 3 Gustilo-Anderson because of that marked degree of contamination. Are you understanding? So after the degree of contamination, you have to speak about the size of the wound. Is it clear? Now, the size of the wound, when the wound is less than 1 centimeter, it's said to be class 1 Gustilo-Anderson. When the wound is 1 to 10 centimeters, it is class 2 Gustilo-Anderson. And when the wound is greater than 10 centimeters, it is class 3 Gustilo-Anderson. So if you have a patient that comes to you having a wound size of less than 1 centimeters, he has a moderate contamination, and then he has a high speed. He was moving at high speed, and then he has an open fracture. It means that that patient is already in class 3 based on the high speed. Is it clear? It's not based on the wound size, not the degree of contamination. Are you seeing? Or you have another patient that had a low energy, meaning that he was just walking on the road and then he fell. He had just a low energy. You have a mild degree, and then the wound size is high. Is it clear? You have low energy, you have mild degree of contamination, but the wound size is high. That's already a Gustilo-Anderson 3 classification. Is it clear? Now, every time that you have the Gustilo-Anderson 3 classification, it brings you now to another part. Is it clear? Every time that you have the Gustilo-Anderson 3 classification based on the wound size, if you have the Gustilo-Anderson classification based on the wound size, is it clear? So you need to evaluate another element. A is that if the wound size is greater than 10 centimeters, you should find if the wound is opposable. Is it clear? Is the wound opposable? Provided the wound is opposable, it means that the site of the wound is opposable and there is no periosteal stripping. There is no periosteal stripping. It means that there is no loss of the periosteum. It means that it is Gustilo-Anderson 3A. Is it clear? This is Griswold-Anderson tree having its component. That's the Griswold-Anderson tree based on the wound size. So if the wound size is greater than 10 centimeter, and then it is the wound is opposable, and then there is no periosteal seeping, it is Griswold-Anderson tree A. Now for Griswold-Anderson tree B, if it is non-opposable, meaning that the wound is non-opposable, and there is periosteal stripping. Is it clear? Every time there is periosteal stripping, it means that it is a Griswold-Anderson tree B. And Griswold-Anderson tree C is now a wound that is so in this case, every time that you have an open fracture with a open fracture, if you have an open fracture with a major neurological damage, is it clear? Neurovascular damage. If you have an open fracture with a major neurovascular damage requiring repair, is it clear? Requiring repair, and that repair is called a primary nerve repair. Is it clear? Where you come and oppose the two nerves together. Is it clear? It is called a primary nerve repair or a primary vascular repair. Is it clear? So if a patient has an open fracture requiring with a major neurovascular damage requiring requiring repair or surgery, that's a primary nerve repair or primary artery repair, it is going to be the Griswold-Anderson tree C. I hope you're understanding. So those are the elements involved in the classification of open fractures. So generally, that is the major classification of open fractures. Now we are going to move out now to the other fracture classification, that is the pediatric immature, the pediatric fractures or fractures involving the immature bones.